Well, a likely Islamist attack in Southend has highlighted the terrorist threat this country faces. Sohail Ahmed is a former Islamist and now counter-extremism practitioner and joins me in the studio. Sohail, thank you so much for coming back. We were speaking yesterday on the programme and unfortunately our interview had to be curtailed a little bit because of what was going on in the House of Commons. We were talking about the threat that the United Kingdom faces, and you think that that threat has grown in the last few years?
Absolutely. Every single time an Islamist terror attack has been carried out in our country, it has been a declaration of war against the United Kingdom. And it hasn't been a declaration of war by any foreign nation state, nor by any uniformed officer of any army, but a declaration of war by a quasi-political, quasi-religious ideology, the ideology of Islamism. Now, it poses an existential threat to the UK and to the West at large. And if we don't come to grips with the severity of the threat we're facing, the gravity of the situation that has befallen us, we would have made a fatal mistake. And it will lead to the inevitable degradation and eventual death of our cherished values.
That's a very, very strong statement. So I'm thinking about other countries in the world that have faced similar attacks, particularly France, for example, that in recent years has seen a spate of Islamist killings, indeed the beheading of a teacher relatively recently. In response to that, I thought that President Macron has actually been pretty bold in terms of standing up for the values of France. And I wonder if that's a route that the UK could potentially follow as well, being much more bold in asserting what British values are as a way to combat this this sort of I don't know, sort of parallel culture that to some extent
A fifth column almost.
That's a strong way to put it.
Yeah.
What would you say to following that sort of playbook?
I would say that I very much like the way in which Macron has been dealing with it. I don't entirely agree with the way he's been dealing with it, but I would like to see the UK be a little bit more bold in the way it tackles with this ideology. For instance, no one dare say that this is name Islamism or even name Islam or talk about the roots of this ideology or how prevalent it is. For instance, I know, and I can't tell you how, but I know that politicians are aware of the extent of this threat, but they don't publicize it. And the reason why they don't publicize it is because somehow they're afraid that white native Britons are somehow going to rise up and lynch every Muslim on the street. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that incredibly insulting. The British people are reasonable. The British people are sensible. They're not xenophobic. They're not racist. They're not Islamophobic. They're not anti-Muslim. And the idea that somehow it's going to lead to civil strife is insane. Now, we live in representative democracies. And how on earth can the public make informed voting decisions if it's not aware of the extent of the threat we face?
So in your view, politicians tiptoeing around the word Islamism is because they don't want to incite something within the British public. That seems like a very odd way to go about politics. It seems like an untruthful way to go about politics. Would you like to see many more politicians standing up and saying that there is an Islamist threat in this country, calling it out by name, and saying that more should be done to tackle it?
I wouldn't want more politicians doing it. I would want all politicians doing it. The fact that this is so prevalent, in my Islamist days, when I left and did a complete 180, I realized that it wasn't just me who was thinking along those lines. There were a lot of other people, and that terrified me. And that's why I'm doing the work I'm doing now.
And there's a bit of a liminal space here between those who sort of are very sort of fundamental followers of a faith, and at what point do those people get sort of turned into actual radical Islamists and potential terrorists? Is there an intervention point where something could be done to stop this conveyor belt?
What I would firstly say is that the majority of Muslims just believe that Islam is about being peaceful and being nice to your fellow heathen. And with them, I obviously have no problem. It's why I consider myself to be a cultural Muslim. But there's two other factors. There's non-violent extremism and there's violent extremism.
Yeah.
Now, somehow just people think that being against violence is evidence of one being moderate. that's a mistake. Just because someone's against violence doesn't mean they're moderate. For instance, if a far-right person said something incredibly racist and they weren't violent, everyone would obviously, talk about how they were bad and censor them even. But when an Islamist preaches, say, anti-Western views or preaches against non-Muslims, we don't do the same thing. There's a double standard at play. Now, the non-violent extremists, they create the environment that allows the violent extremists to grow and fester. And that's what we need to be dealing with. We need to be dealing with not just the violent extremists, but also the non-violent extremists. This goes a lot deeper than people realize.
So it's that one stage before that we need to be looking at, that potentially, if not state intervention, cultural intervention needs to be at play here, saying that certain views, I don't know whether it's anti-democratic or anti-pluralistic views, even if they don't present themselves in terms of violence, they still need to be challenged rigorously in the public sphere.
Absolutely. Now, I'm on the left. I'm actually an active member of the Labour Party. But unfortunately, my side of the political spectrum sometimes, unknowingly in fact, allies itself with Islamists, because the Islamists present themselves as though they're moderate. And sometimes the far left buys into it, and they give them credence. For instance, Islamist groups that have done apologetics for terrorism, like MEND, they've been invited into parliament and have advised government. That's just crazy.